We are live once more with our daily rundown and analysis of what's going on in the Middle East and indeed the East in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Today, we're going to be focusing on the economic impacts and the worst case scenarios, which hopefully we'll avoid, but it's worth understanding what those are. We have not just my eminent co-host David Abato, we have Timothy Ash, one of the world's foremost economists and an absolute expert on what is going on in the global economy and the impacts of this conflagration. But also Timothy is one of the I wouldn't say most outspoken, but one of the most vociferous and principled commentators denouncing Russia's war against Ukraine. Tim, welcome to the channel.
Pleasure to be here again.
Yes, for those who are paying attention, you have indeed been on the format before. This is our new daily live stream format. David, do you want to say a couple of words, plug your channels, and then we'll jump in?
Well, I am also thrilled to have Tim back again. I have spoken with him several times on my podcast on the No Delusion Zone, which oddly enough is actually where it's right here. Wow, that's the No Delusion Zone. That's also my Substack for those of you that don't know or haven't been there. So please join me on the No Delusion Zone, become a subscriber, as well as my Substack, which is protectingtherepublic.com. But I also want to welcome Tim back to speaking with us.
Great.
You deserve that. I found these new buttons.
Sound effects.
Playing with them. Yes.
The sophistication is mind-boggling. It really is.
I've got some other sounds for you, Jonathan, but I'll save them for later.
Clown noises and very scatological,
One of these and a little bit of those. So.
Okay, yeah.
Enough of that nonsense. This is serious stuff. No, it really is. Yeah, Tim, we're going to obviously be talking about the economic impact of what's going on in Iran and Ukraine. Jonathan's got a lot, probably more specific questions than I do, but I want to launch this one very quickly from the top. Most pundits and people that analyze this at all are saying how this is just a godsend. This is just a gift to Russia, to the Kremlin, to Putin. I'm talking, of course, about the increase in oil prices, the spike that happened right after the American attack on Iran. Is this going to be a long-term benefit to Putin and Russia, or is this going to just be a blip? And is it going to save the Russian economy? If you could talk a little bit about that, that would be terrific. Thanks.
No, sure. I mean, look. I guess I've been on this show, and I guess other people have spoken about it. But there's certainly been this durability in the Russian economy over the last 4 years, based on obviously the fact that Putin knew he was going to invade. He built up buffers. Our sanctions haven't been hard enough, strong enough. They've been too well choreographed and telegraphed in advance, and that's given more life, I guess, to the Russian economy and Putin's ability to wage war. But interestingly, I mean, we saw significant sanctions, new sanctions, in the middle of last year. We saw the Rosneft sanctions. We saw the lowering of the oil price cap, and I think we saw new energy from the Western Alliance in terms of willingness to go after some of these ships, the shadow fleet ships. Right? We saw, I guess, the French, the Belgians, some of the Brits, I think the Scandis beginning to board some of these shadow fleet ships. So, the messaging was, we're after you. We're really trying to crimp Russia's energy export receipts. We're willing to do more about it. And actually, the data flow at the turn of the year and early this year had suggested it was having effect, right? So Russia's energy export receipts, January, February, were like half the year early level. The budget was running I think the budget deficit for the first couple of months was like 1.5% of GDP, which is almost a full year target, right?
Yeah.
But the current account deficit was wider. Sorry, the current account surplus was a lot lower. The trade deficit was significantly lower. And we saw the Russians mindful of this, I guess, taking action to kind of buoy the budget and budget revenues and all that kind of stuff. So we saw the increase in VAT from 20 to 22%. We saw messaging that likely there was going to be across the board cut in budget spending by the Ministry of Finance, a 10% cut. So, a lot was suggesting that finally things are getting difficult. And actually, if you look at the oil price discount for Urals blend, the Russian benchmark versus WTI and Brent, it had reached like 30%, right? So the Russians were exporting less. Actually, the physical volume of exports of oil also were way down. I think partly because of the success of those deep strikes by the Ukrainians, but also, the long-term drag of sanctions, which made it very difficult for the Russians to continue to maintain its energy production. I mean, the basic maintenance, I guess, in terms of its energy facilities, and then again that inability to fund and access Western energy-related technology also made it more difficult to put production back online, given what the Ukrainians were doing, right? So again, that was another of the factors. Few lower export revenues, physical volumes. They were getting less for it, and we saw that appear in the increased budget deficit, the lower export receipts, the lower budget the lower merchandise trade surplus, and the current account surplus, right? So things were getting more difficult, and then we had manna from heaven. We had this U.S. attack on Iran, U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran. We can debate the logic of it, whatever. But suddenly, obviously, it spiked energy prices higher, significantly higher. It's also reduced that discount I mentioned on Urals relative to Brent and WTI. Actually, Russian oil is now trading at a premium to those, right? So the Russians are getting significantly more oil and energy revenues. I mean, there have been some calculations that if oil prices stay where they are, Russia could be getting something like $10 billion a month additional energy sector receipts. And I think that has breathed new life into Putin and the Russian war machine. I think there's an assumption that as long as the US remains engaged in this war, oil and energy prices will remain higher, and that will be, obviously to the benefit of the Russian economy and etc. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that in a way, that there are many moving parts when we think of this. I mean, lots of supply chain disruption. Russia will benefit also from a lot of other stuff like fertilizer, obviously. But actually, the other angle is sometimes it's the law of unexpected consequences, or we don't quite know how this crisis or the Gulf War III will impact on different markets. So one interesting development that no one really expected, I think, was the fact that gold prices, which had been riding high, at almost $5,500 an ounce, dropped by about $1,000, right, about 20%. Now, actually, one notable thing over the last 3-4 years is as gold prices have rallied, it's helped the Russians counterbalance the use of foreign exchange reserves, right? I mean, we've obviously frozen, about 300 billion of reserves, but actually, if you look at the gross number of FX reserves have risen. I mean, that's partly the gold valuation effect. If you think gold prices are up, 2.5-3 times. So my estimates are the Russian central bank benefited to the tune of something like about $200 billion in terms of gold valuation effects. Actually, now the 20% drop in gold prices will hurt them, probably about $60 billion loss, right? So, I mean, it's a stock and flow story. They benefit from increased oil receipts. That's a flow. Their stock of wealth will be impacted by that hit in terms of gold prices. Now, the other interesting angle is slightly longer term. So, I mean, short term, it's clear, right? Russia's a big beneficiary. It exports commodities. There are all these supply disruptions coming from the Gulf. It will increase commodity prices. That will be the benefit. But if you think through the longer term implications of this, I mean, the world's suffering a huge oil price and another commodity shock related to this. One of the likely consequences will be the oil market will balance by demand destruction, right? Higher oil prices mean lower global growth. Now, that could mean a year down the line, significantly lower oil and commodity prices, right? Oil might not stay at $100 or $110 or $150. the fact that it goes to 150 will crimp global demand, and it's possible to imagine a scenario a year down the line where oil prices could actually be lower than they were when we started the war. I mean, it may take some time. It may not help Trump out in the midterms, but a year from now, I mean, and if Russia was already struggling when oil was at $60 a barrel, although it was only getting something like 35, 40, imagine if oil is down at 50 or sub 50. I mean, that will be catastrophic for the Russian economy. So, Putin may be rejoicing in the short term, but this creates some real structural challenges, I guess, longer term for the Russians. Now, the other interesting angle, I think, combined with all this is that, what we've seen actually is the Ukrainians taking advantage, or not taking advantage, that's the wrong word. I mean, I guess recognizing that the power of global markets and using global markets to get what you want, right? I mean, we've seen that with Iran, clearly, closing the straits, attacking Gulf sector assets, forcing a global economic crisis, which has given them leverage in negotiations with the Russians and more generally. And I think the Ukrainians have said, well, actually, what about us? And we don't want a situation where the war in Iran, I mean, Trump and Israel's decision to wage a full-scale war now on Iran, we don't want the implications of that to be to screw us by helping the Russians by increasing oil export receipts. So actually what we've seen is the Ukrainians step up attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. I mean, in a way, the gloves are off, right? I mean, there's been attacks this week on Primorsk, elsewhere, just outside St. Petersburg.
Ust-Luga, Vyborg,
Correct.
Novorossiysk was hit earlier in the month.
Like 40% of Russia's export capacity is kind of offline. Now, again, Russia will
That's
benefit
huge, isn't it, Tim? I mean, we haven't seen those figures or anything approaching those figures. The last reported figure was 17% offline, which was mid last year. But very quickly, that reverted down to only 10%, and they fixed the issues. When you say gloves off, it looks like the Ukrainians are really trying to take that capacity down, not just dent it.
Yeah. Well, look, I think the Ukrainians, they've had a couple of things. One is, what's the game changer, perhaps, is the Ukrainians have been working on deep strike capability, right? I mean, if you go back a couple of years, right, there was a lot of focus on US-provided long-range missiles, so ATACMS and HIMARS. And the Americans, I guess, provided them, but there were strings attached. The strings attached were, don't do anything that will impact on global markets and drive energy and oil prices higher, right? So there was some constraint on the Ukrainians, and generally they kind of abided by that. I think what's changed for the Ukrainians has been that clearly the US has acted in Iran certainly against Ukrainian interests. I mean, in one sense, yes, taking out Iranian, drone capability, helps the Ukrainians. I mean, clearly the Iranians have been supplying Russia with that capability. But actually, intervention that causes a global oil crisis and higher oil and energy prices helps sustain the Russians. And I think the Ukraine, and also the other angle is that clearly the Americans have now prioritized supplying Israel and US and perhaps even Gulf states with air defense capability. So all those Patriot missile systems that Ukraine needs. I mean, I saw one figure that suggested in a couple of days, the Gulf states blew through the same number of Patriot missiles that Ukraine had been provided in 4 years. So I think the Ukrainians are saying, look, America decided to wage this war on Iran that is not necessarily in our interests. That's going to help the Russians in terms of higher oil prices, and it means that we're going to get less help from you in terms of Patriot missile defense systems and all those kind of defensive missiles. So actually, why should we follow your script anymore? We're increasingly autonomous. We're increasingly self-sufficient in terms of our defense capabilities. We're less reliant on America. So actually, let's do what is in our interests. And our interest absolutely is making sure Russia cannot export oil products, oil and crude and oil products. And they're doing it, right? They're acting on it. And the other angle is, they develop their own long strike drone capability. Remarkable. Ranges of 2,000 miles, etc., and reasonable accuracy, right? So that's what I think what we've seen. Bit of a game changer. the Ukrainians, famously Trump in that White House meeting a year or so ago said the Ukrainians had no cards. I mean, the Ukrainians have found a pack of cards with pictures of drones on them. and I guess, if you remember, famously, I guess the Americans produced that pack of cards on the Saddam Hussein regime. Remember that one?
It was part of that.
I think the Ukrainians have probably got the same pack of cards, but it has targets, energy sector targets in Russia that they're going through.
Well, Tim, to follow up on what you're saying, about Ukraine having the gloves off, I had just thrown up something. They just recently signed a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, on their own. In fact, Zelensky, I believe, is there now, or he was there yesterday, to further this along. So, they're taking leaps and bounds on their own, pretty much saying, okay, let's see who has the cards. And that is part of those deep strikes that you just talked about, and Jonathan and I have discussed before. And I believe Jonathan's right. I mean, I think they're trying to not eliminate, but take out a very larger percentage of the Russian oil and gas facilities than they did before. And they're doing pretty well. I'm not sure. What is, Jonathan, maybe you know, or Tim, the status of their Flamingo ballistic missile? Does anybody know? I haven't followed that recently.
There seem to be a few more strikes reportedly using Flamingo. There was some uncorroborated information from last year that actually the quantity of Flamingo was in some doubt, that the accuracy of them was in some doubt. But of course, they're rightly very cagey about it. The latest discussion points seem to be that the quantities are increasing and the accuracy is increasing, but we don't, as far as I know, we don't have any figures on what those quantities are. They're used quite sparingly, because seems to me, and I'll chat this over to Tim, seems to be as much a psychological weapon as it is a physical one, because long range drones seem to be able to do, maybe jobs that are not too dissimilar, although maybe Flamingo is better at evading air defense.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one interesting takeout from the war in the Gulf, I mean, what we've seen is the amazing what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, drones are a game changer in terms of military warfare. I mean, we're kind of learning that. Well, we should have learned it. I mean, but actually the changing sort of target sets. I mean, if you think of Iran on Israel and the Gulf states, I mean, initially the target was mostly Israel, obviously, with ballistic missiles and drones. And Israel is a really hard target. I mean, it's a long way away. It's very well defended, and it's a relatively small piece of land to defend. I think what the Iranians have figured out is that, if you expand the target range to include the Gulf, this is a huge area, target-rich area with lots of high-value assets, right? And it's really difficult to defend. So they've figured it out. They've kind of moved away from really only focusing on Israel to focusing on this wider set of targets that has global impact. And I think it's a bit the same with the Ukrainians and the Russians, right? I mean, the Russians are finding it very hard to defend a very long, it's a huge country, dispersed assets. Russia's air defenses have been really stretched, and especially the longer range. The fact that the Ukrainians, 2,000 kilometers or perhaps more, etc., makes it very difficult. Interestingly, if you look at the attacks recently on, around St. Petersburg, I don't think it was Flamingo. I mean, it seems to be relatively low tech. Well, they look low tech. Relatively low tech, almost light aircraft style things, right? That fly very low underneath the radar. They're slow, but they're very accurate. And I guess if you send enough over against these targets that are very difficult to defend against, you can wreak carnage, right? And that seems to be the Ukrainian experience. And just on that issue of, we hear that something like 200 Ukrainian military advisors are in the Gulf states helping various countries. Again, it's a story about the Ukrainians getting leverage, right? Suddenly a country that had no cards is now number one, drone defense country, right? I mean, they have stuff to offer. Actually, the incredible thing is the Americans seem to learn nothing. I mean, the irony of all this is that, 4 years of this war where it's been obvious to everyone that drones were the game changer. And the US military seemed to learn very little from that experience, right? I mean, the success of the Iranians across, if you look at the attacks on US bases across the region, I mean, I was looking at a report today, a number of those bases are the Americans can't use them anymore because of, again, low-tech Iranian drone attacks. I mean, why haven't the US learned from what's gone on in Ukraine? I mean, it's extraordinary that you would launch a war against Iran, and Iran was a known like drone superpower, right? I mean, if you think of the global drone superpowers, it's obviously you think it was the US, but it's certainly China, Iran, Turkey, Ukraine.
Well, Tim,
I mean, they're the countries that,
as an economist, let me just tell you. I'll answer your question for the Americans. We don't like to make cheap things. We like to make very, very expensive things that could pad the pockets of our defense contractors. We love Patriot missiles at $1 billion each or whatever they are, and as well as high tech missiles and the aircraft, and not to mention our tanks, which are almost obsolete now. To make a cheap drone, something that you can almost assemble or buy off the shelf, that's just not in our DNA. We'd rather take out a $10,000 drone with a multi-billion-dollar Patriot missile system. And I'm joking, but it's true. The defense industry in this country, as it is in most countries, control a lot. They control a lot of what's going on in the government.
Contract. There was discussion on some Ukrainian channels sort of, rolling their eyes. It looks like a large-scale contract for not one of the primes, but what do you call them? A subprime defense contractor. I don't think they call themselves that. But again, Ukrainians look at these going like, well, yeah, we don't want any of these things because one, the unit cost is still ridiculous. You're talking tens of thousands, not below the sort of 10K, which the Ukrainian interceptors typically $1,500 to $3,000. And they're buying a job lot of these things, which are then going to sit on a shelf. And Ukrainians, well, that's no good because they have a shelf life of let's say of milk. Stick them on a shelf, they're not going to be good to man or beast in the theater of war.
I mean, one interesting thing, again, trying to think over, what we've learned from Ukraine and now with this Gulf War 3, etc. I mean, one thing that has been pretty noticeable, right, is, the importance of the Straits of Hormuz, right? And I guess the reluctance of the US, which has this unbelievably powerful naval, navy, right? Two the biggest aircraft carriers in the world. It's bringing all these kind of helicopter carriers and marine carriers, whatever you want to call them, over. Huge number of destroyers, etc. I mean, the unwillingness of the US to put sort of destroyers and that naval capability, to convoys, all these kind of things. It makes you think that actually the Americans are looking what happened now in the Black Sea and are thinking, are we really sure? Are we confident that the Iranians haven't done as well as the Ukrainians did, in terms of naval drones, right? I mean, imagine a scenario where the Americans do try and run a convoy system through the Straits. And if the Iranians have gone as far as the Ukrainians with naval drone technology, I mean, imagine a scenario where you see a couple of destroyers, US destroyers, taken out by cheap Iranian naval drones. I mean, it's catastrophic in terms of, the perceptions of the US as a naval power, right? I mean, and it has been the case in the Black Sea. We've been there, we've spoken about it. The fact that Ukraine, a country without a navy, has driven, has defeated Russia, a naval power in the Black Sea that is no longer able to sail its ships in the Black Sea. So I just wonder there what the messaging is, that actually, we don't want to do that. We don't want to risk putting our destroyers or whatever you want to call it into that position that, we could expose our own weakness. And I tell you what, one big takeout for me from all this is, I'm absolutely clear, 100%. The one country that has totally learned from the war in Ukraine in terms of drone is China. Without a doubt, they'll be watching what happened in the Black Sea with naval drones, and you can guarantee they're at the forefront of naval drone technology, perhaps even taking the Ukrainians, even beyond going what the Ukrainians have achieved. So, Again, extraordinary things we're seeing. We learn massive amounts, or we should have learned massive amounts from the war in Ukraine. We're seeing the change in nature of warfare in general, I guess, because of all this.
Well, we don't want to propagate unfounded or unverified information, but there was an interesting video put out by two YouTubers, one Ryan Macbeth, one Preston Stewart. Actually, Preston's a very thoughtful kind of military analyst, ex-US military. He pointed to something very weird that Trump had said just last week, claiming, and then he never repeated this. I think he was, someone got through to him and said, yeah, don't say that again. He intimated that one US warship had shot down 100 Iranian missiles in a day.
So 101.
101. This kind of suggests there has already been some pretty full-on kind of kinetic confrontations that are being completely smothered in a media blackout. And then, of course, they withdrew their vessels. So it could be that maybe some of these confrontations either have depleted their stocks to an extent that they're worried, or that they fear just the scenario you're talking about, which is that actually some of this stuff will get through and the optics of it will be disastrous. But this is unverified, but it's quite plausible, actually, that this may be going on. And the question I wanted to ask you in relation to this, it seems that Iran has not really deployed its what are believed to be huge stocks of speedboats, dare I say, speedboats that could ram into ships, etc., or deploy small landing parties. They haven't activated the Houthis in the Red Sea. If this really does kick off and Trump pushes for boots on the ground, an invasion of Karg or some of the other islands, and Iran takes the gloves off, well, not so much militarily, but what's the economic impact of that? It could go very, very dark very quickly, I'm assuming.
Well, I guess a lot of economists are looking at developments in the Gulf, and particularly with oil prices, and the way markets have performed generally. I mean, you have this. I mean, I guess the game changer for me, really, and the irony, I guess, in many respects, was, Iran focused on its nuclear program, right? And the nuclear program was the deterrent, right? I mean, so, and it wasn't getting a nuclear weapon, which the Iranians saw as the deterrent. It was not getting it, right? So it's reaching that threshold that they could potentially go for it. But the message was, if you attack us, we will, so don't attack us, right? In a way, that proved disastrous for the Iranians, right? In the end, it was no deterrence. They were attacked anyway, right? And so the Iranians have been looking around for a new deterrence, and actually it was on their doorstep. I mean, what it was a combination of two things. It was a combination, I would say, of drones and the Ukraine war reality that there's no 100% defense against drones. This idea, it's a war of iteration. It's a war of attrition in a way, and, the economics of drone and missile warfare these days, and there's been a lot spoken about, using a $4 million missile, and whatever, anti-air missile to defeat a 20,000 drone. There's that, but actually it's also about war iteration in terms of what we've seen in war in Ukraine is, it's one side gets the slight advantage, maybe the attacker, the ratio of long strike drones that get through goes from 5% to 20% for a couple of weeks, and then the defender gets the advantage back, right? But there's no 100% defense, right? So if you send enough drones and you're clever in how you deploy them and all that stuff, you're going to hit assets, you're going to hit some stuff. And the other angle was that the Iranians figured out was actually now the Gulf states' visions, their Vision 2030 Saudi, this whole development strategy of the Gulf states, which was about diversification, right? It was about moving from energy to other stuff, tourism, logistics, fertilizer, everything. Means that, the Gulf, it's not just about oil. It's not comparing oil prices now with 1974 or whenever, right? I mean, you can look at real price and say, well, actually, it's a lot bigger shock in the 70s, right? What's different is the Gulf states now are in so many supply chains, right? And, and a lot of the stuff comes through the straits, whether it's oil or fertilizer. So, and it, as I said before, I mean, it's very difficult to defend a huge area against drones, that some are always going to get through, right? And and the Iranians are very clever in understanding. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Dubai Airport now, I think, is the busiest international airport in the world, right? I mean, it carries lots of tourists to come to Dubai. Dubai is a global tourism center, a global city. But a lot of this development has been funded by debt, right? I mean, a lot of debt out of China, right, or Asia. Asian investors have invested in building airports and hotels and all these kind of things. I mean, if the Gulf states are no longer secure because of this drone threat from Iran, I guess the whole business model is in doubt of the Gulf states, right? So the new deterrence from the Iranians is not the nuclear thing, which was kind of a disaster. It's their ability to hit Gulf states on their doorsteps with cheap drones and to disrupt global markets systemically, right? I mean, I think we are facing a systemic global threat from this because of the disruption to supply chains, which is kind of very similar to COVID in a way. And we, in many respects, we don't really know where the disruptions are going to come, right? And the market at the moment doesn't seem to be really pricing that. If you look at equity markets, they're not really adjusting as they were perhaps during the COVID period. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking. There's a lot of thoughts that, well, it's going to be over in a couple of weeks and it'll all clear up. And, surely the Iranians are, a normal, rational people, and they'll just, they'll come to some kind of deal. I'm not sure that's the case. Well, I mean, they're rational, but they're operating on their own kind of objective function. And it's evolving and changing, right? And I think at the moment what we're seeing is the Iranians are trying to find out the deterrence point. It's a concept that clearly they figured out that Trump cares about global markets, cares where the S&P is, cares where oil prices are, TACO, this kind of story, right? And I guess clearly what we've seen is Trump try and escalate in terms of rhetoric, threats to hit energy infrastructure. And then markets react negatively, and then he's forced to pull back from it. I think from the Iranian perspective, they base it, for them, it's about the existential nature of the threat to their regime. They want a new deterrent. They think the deterrent is this ability to impact or hit Gulf states, keep the straits closed, the impact on global markets. They're figuring out where this market adjustment, where's the pain point for Trump? To give them encouragement that Trump won't risk it again. He won't attack them again. And that's their new deterrence. And I guess we're finding that now. But again, the Ukrainians are probably doing something similar, right? I mean, they're figuring out, the global market's pain point in terms of their attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure. It's something very similar. So, I mean, this is a war of, it's a war of global supply chains, very much this obviously war in the Gulf, but I guess maybe the Ukrainians are learning something from that. So I guess there's a lot of things we can learn, both from the war in Ukraine and what we're seeing now, and all those kind of things.
This failure to understand the rationality of our adversary seems really important here, Tim. So, for instance, we fail to understand the rationality of Putin invading Ukraine because it seemed utterly irrational from our perspective. But from his perspective, it's about regime consolidation, the false information that he got, that it would be easy and quick because he'd hollowed out the Ukrainian state, etc., etc. So that's failure to understand, the thought process and framework there. In Iran, the same thing here. We think it'd be irrational for them to give in, but actually, isn't it the case that what they're getting out of this is something they didn't have before? So the rationality is to double down. There are countries now paying them for their navy to be escorted through the straits. There's pressure on many countries to sort of lift sanctions and normalize relations with Iran, just to have access to the sort of key transit. Plus, there's some global sympathy, let's say, for Iran, not necessarily for the regime, well, in some quarters even for the regime, unfortunately, but also they've been able to double down and suppress the protests that look like it might unseat their regime. So actually all the rationality seems to be to double down, not strike a deal. And we fail to sort of understand that perspective at our peril.
Yeah, no, you're right there. I mean, look, as you know, I mean, I did expect the full-scale invasion of Ukraine to happen because it was logical from Putin's perspective, right? He cared deeply about Ukraine, and he saw an opportunity. I mean, that's the reality. He saw Ukraine as weak, the West as weak. He saw the carbon transition as reducing his leverage in the energy sector. And he thought, if I don't do it now, I'll miss the opportunity, right? And essentially, that's why he did it. And he thought the Western response would be pretty weak. So we didn't signal enough to him what the consequences were going to be in reality.
He
right?
didn't factor in any Ukrainian resistance. In fact, that's his failing. And domestically, he was paranoid, and he thought this would shore up his regime internally. In some ways, it actually has.
Which it did, actually.
It actually did,
yeah. Yeah.
I mean, on the other angle is, I mean, specifically on, I guess, on the Iran scenario, right? I mean, there's some wonderful Iran, Middle East, but I'm not. You guys know that I'm a Russia-Ukraine person. But applying the same kind of logic as I applied to the war in Ukraine and reading some of these wonderful, Middle Eastern, Israeli, I mean, there's loads of great commentators. And I mean, the consensus was that, if you make this existential to the regime, they will. I mean, I guess there was a view out there that, the Iranians wouldn't kill the golden goose. They wouldn't close the straits. They wouldn't hit regional energy infrastructure because they'd be shooting themselves in the feet. That was the logic, right? Well, yes, that's fair enough. But if the regime thinks they're on their last legs, and it's existential, and their last option is to do that by escalating to hit energy assets, they obviously would, right? And unfortunately, I guess the mistake maybe the Trump administration made was spelling it out right from the start that it was going to be existential by saying it's about regime change and taking Khamenei out. It meant that the regime, a despicable regime. I mean, I'd certainly agree with that, but in a way, they then thought, well, what option do we have? In a way, the US and Israeli regime change drives or ambitions, whatever, meant that they went nuclear, or they didn't go nuclear, but they did the next best thing in their minds, which was basically take it global and impact on global energy supply chains. So. That's, and I guess it was obvious, right? I mean, I thought that, I did think that would happen. I didn't think the US administration would be stupid enough to make it existential.
Never underestimate their stupidity, please.
Yeah. And we're in a worst case, in a way, we're in a no man's land where, the US is not prepared to do what it takes for regime change. So clearly, boots on the ground is off the agenda, right?
Well,
you think it's off the agenda.
It's been asked, where are the fast attack boats of the Iranians, which they have a lot. I mean, they've got tens of thousands. I think it's not clear to everyone, but they're waiting to see if the U.S. or, God forbid, the Europeans provide military convoys to try to guide through these tankers.
Which is not going to happen.
Well, you never know with Trump. No. I again, never say never with some lunatic idea like that. But if that happens, or something similar to that, trying to guide the tankers through the Strait of Hormuz with some military assistance, then you're going to see the attack boats. There's no question about that. You're also going to see the strait heavily mined, which we haven't seen yet.
Supposedly 33,000 attack boats is a figure that's been floating around.
Or 40,000.
Crazy number.
There are a lot.
In that respect, Britain looks like it's about to get involved in naval skirmishes on two fronts. And really without the capability maybe to do a single front. I don't know what you think, Tim, about this announcement that Starmer's made, that we are going to be far more proactive, far more interventionist in tackling Shadow Fleet tankers, including apparently using sort of SBS and special operations forces. Can you see that happening? Because all the talk so far has only led to, I would say, sporadic and almost performative interdictions.
Well, as has been much portrayed and debated in the UK media. I mean, I guess the positive, I mean, you know, I'm not sure the UK really wants to get dragged into the war in the Gulf. The positive is we simply lack naval capability, right? I mean, and in a way, it's a saving grace for us, right? If we had naval capability, if we could bring something to the table, maybe we'd be more involved than we are, right? You know, I mean, for me, again, this is a huge distraction for the UK in terms of what our priorities should be, right? The existential threat to the UK has not been Iran. It's a terrible regime, and I get all that, right? But actually, it's defending the UK shores and the European theatre. And the biggest existential threat to Europe and the UK is Russia, right? It's not Iran, it's not China, right? And, you know, clearly we have finite, very limited defence resources. We've made terrible decisions over many decades in terms of what we've invested in. And we're in this sad position where we lack sufficient naval assets to get involved actually in the Gulf War, as I mentioned, but actually to defend ourselves. And you know, even stopping a few Russian tankers going through the channel is a major challenge for the UK Navy, right? And that's the sad reality, right? I mean, you know, we have no air defences to defend the UK. I mean, a lot of focus on, you know, the Iranian, you know, long-range missile launches against Diego Garcia, and you know, wow, it's a threat to UK interests, right? And suddenly the UK is within range. Well, we have no anti-ballistic missile defense system, right? I mean, I guess we hope everyone else before all those countries in between get there first, right? I mean, we are in a sad state, and I mean, the one silver lining I would say perhaps from the Gulf War in the UK is that it's helping change popular perceptions of the need for increased defence and security spending, right? I mean, I think one of the well, you know, it's been a sad indictment of the European political class, I would say, that after 4 years of war in Ukraine, we haven't really won the debate domestically in terms of the need for increased defence spending, right? I mean, we've made those commitments to go to 2% of GDP on defence, 2.3 and then 3.5 or whatever over a period of time. But I don't think really we've explained it to our populations, right, adequately. And that's extraordinary, right? I mean, and actually, I guess the war in the Gulf as is, you know, opinion polls seem to be moving more in favour of the need for increased defence and security spending, and I would hope that, you know, eventually that does lead to a change. You know, I mean, the problem in the UK also is our economy is in such a dire position, right? Again, the failures of multiple governments. I mean, I wouldn't particularly blame the Starmer administration. I mean, it's decades of failed policy across a range of fronts. When you think of the UK, it's no strategy on loads of things, right? You know, we could look at defence, but I'd say transport policy, education policy, health, housing, energy, you name it. There's been no joined up long-term thinking for a very long time, right? And that's, we are where we are in an economy that has a lot of public sector debt, you know, high public sector borrowing needs, high bond interest rates as a result, and not much space for increased defence spending now. So, you know, we are in a pretty difficult position, right? We don't have the assets, we don't have the military assets to make a difference, particularly, and you know, we're not in a position, say, like Germany, that has lots of fiscal space to spend a lot of money on getting or rebuilding your defence military industrial complex. And eventually, the Germans will get the capability. I guess the Brits and the French are in a similar position. We're both in a pretty dire economic position where we don't have loads of spare fiscal resources to suddenly pump prime our defence spending to get where we can actually defend ourselves.
I mean, my last question on this one is, could Trump's actually talked about oil prices potentially dropping post-crisis and actually quite precipitously? Does that also assume that Trump's actions could lead to a recession of some sort, global recession, or even worse, depression scenario. People have talked a little bit about the 1930s. They've talked about 1973. Are we in dangerous territory here, triggering a broader crisis?
Sorry, I missed the question. Could you just repeat it?
Yes, are we potentially facing a broader economic crisis, recession, depression, triggered by Trump's actions, especially if, as seems likely, he's going to put boots on the ground?
Well, as I said, the Gulf region is globally systemic, right? Those really important supply chains across a number of sectors are being disrupted, right? I would think that, oil is already, I mean, we focus on Brent and WTI, that, I think WTI is still 90s and Brent is 110 or 111 today. But if you look at some of those Middle East benchmarks, I mean, they're already like 130, 140, 150, right? I mean, that's energy off to Asia. I think those level of oil prices, will cause a growth slowdown. As I mentioned, there will be demand destruction, and I think some of the supply chain disruptions could create some systemic problems in particular sectors. I mentioned the Gulf states. I mean, they are, I mean, is there a future for tourism in the Gulf states? Unless, I mean, it's why the Gulf states really are so focused on, I mean, the message to the Americans is, you started this, you need to finish it, right? I mean, one way or another, we had some security, and our whole, I mean, this whole business model, this vision, again, the visions the Gulf states had, and their diversification to tourism and logistics, all that stuff. It was built on the premise of security, and the security was built on the US security umbrella, plus some kind of quid pro quo with Iran, right? I mean, we've seen a reach out. I mean, I guess the Saudis, after the, I think, 2017, the Iranian attack on some of their energy infrastructure, there was a reach out from the Gulf states to Iran and more economic engagements. And the message was, look, please don't attack us. We'll work with you and we'll help your economic development. And that was a quid pro quo, right? I mean, this war has gone to a different level. That's gone out the window, right? I mean, the US security umbrella has not proven, perhaps as assured as the Gulf states thought. And Iran has crossed the line in attacking lots of Gulf assets, right? So the question of the Gulf states is, how do we return that security that can allow our diversification programs to continue? But what happens if it doesn't return, right? I mean, again, a lot of those business sectors, tourism, air travel out of the Gulf states, logistics, can they continue to function? And then the question is, what are the knock-on effects? What happens if it no longer makes economic or commercial sense to do those things? And again, they've been funded out of debt. So do we see like a domino effect of credit events in particular sectors, companies in the Gulf, and then you see knock-on effects to Asian credit markets? I mean, the world's very joined up. We saw that with COVID, and we saw that during the global financial crisis, right? I mean, it doesn't take much for an extra, a risk event to happen in one particular space or area to have, knock-on effects globally. And I mean, as I said, I do think that the Gulf states are systemically important for the global economy now, and not just about oil and energy. It's broader than that. And so this crisis needs to end soon. The Gulf states need to get security soon again. And how do you achieve that? I guess, Trump holding up his hand and saying, that's it, the war's over, I'm off home, I'm off to Cuba or wherever he's going to go, and saying it's your mess, clean it up. That doesn't really work, right? I mean, so I guess the solutions are either, escalation, so boots on the ground, whatever, the US finally sorting the Iranian problem out, the Islamic Republic problem out, or cutting a deal, going back to JCPOA 2, and that deal would have to be some assurance for Iran that they're not going to get attacked anytime soon, and the sanctions moderation and economic support for Iran to rebuild their economy. I mean, they're the options, right? I mean, 3 options. Trump decides, it's your problem, I'm off, right? Which doesn't solve the problem. It just makes it's a huge problem then for the Gulf states in particular. or you see, escalation to boots on the ground. Again, we know the politics of that in the US won't be very popular, and boots on the ground have not proven very successful in the past. Obviously, Iraq, Afghanistan, or some deal, and that's it.
Well, if it's up to Trump, it's not going to be over soon, unfortunately. And I just want to add, if the UK makes the unfortunate decision to unilaterally intervene militarily, I think that's going to be a very bad decision. So I hope that's not what's happening, but it actually may. But no, I don't think Trump's going to make a decision to make this go away anytime soon. Unfortunately, I believe there are going to be boots on the ground. Where exactly and what the missions will be, we've talked about it a lot here. We don't know until it happens, but it's not going to end well, in my opinion. Jonathan, last word.
Last word. So, well, we're going to watch this space because things are kicking off. Ukraine has decided to impose its own kinetic sanctions to counteract the US lifting sanctions on Sibneft, Rosneft, and so on. And those kinetic sanctions are far more effective than anything anyone else in the world seems to have done. It could be that Britain's decision to interdict more aggressively is tied to Ukraine's decision to interdict, to strike. It would be interesting if there's coordination there. I think we should look at what's going on. And maybe the British decision is also in reaction to seeing the US slide towards a far more Russian, not even Russian appeasing stance, but a Russia supporting stance. That's something we're going to unpack in these discussions over the next couple of days. Tim, thank you so much for coming back on and for giving us a whole hour of your time, which is incredibly generous. I know the audience is going to appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye now.
Right, we're going to wind the stream down. David, thanks so much. We will be back on Monday to follow up on whatever has been going on. I'm sure there'll be plenty to
over the weekend. It's going to be insane, I'm sure. So please, folks, come back here same time, which is 10 Eastern, and I believe 2 p.m. UK time for more thrills and spills from the Middle East. And
if those are interested, my video tonight is going to be with Michael Nance, but we're also going to try and get him on this format. I think he would be a very strong voice to add to this, especially with boots on the ground in Karg. Hopefully we can bring you Malcolm live sometime next week. I'm going to try and see if we can arrange that as well as other experts. David, thank you so much.
Cheers. Take care to all.